Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the cartoonist behind the upcoming Sleep at Image Comics. It's Zander Cannon. Thanks for coming on, Zander.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we are recording this on Monday, March 17th, which feels like necessary context because this isn't going to run for 2 weeks, and who knows what the world will be like when this debuts. I will be in Hawaii, so hopefully it has nothing to do with Hawaii. But as of this moment, Zander, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's St. Patrick's Day. I mean, you know.
That's true.
I'm not even wearing green. Someone's going to pinch me.
I have forgotten that it's St. Patrick's Day like 5 times already.
Totally.
I was texting with a friend who lives in Ireland, and he made some sort of comment about like things shutting down in Ireland. And I was just like, why are things shutting down in Ireland? And he's like, it's St. Patrick's Day. And I'm like, oh my God, how do I keep forgetting this?
Right. Right. Yeah. It doesn't seem to be a big deal here. Maybe downtown there's a parade. I don't know. Probably not.
It was a much bigger deal for me when I went out carousing with my friends back in the day.
Yeah, sure. But yeah, I wouldn't have known.
Well, I mean, you're in your studio. I assume today is a working day for you?
Today is a working day. Yeah. It's, drawing, emailing, the usual.
So what have you been drawing? More sleep?
Well, yeah, more sleep. And I'm working out, debating taking on some other like work for hire stuff just to to slot in. It might not be a great idea.
How do you decide what to take on? I mean, because you have to have a capacity, right?
Yeah, I mean, usually if it's something, it was talking about doing some layouts.
Okay.
If I can do them in a very straightforward way and there's not a lot of back and forth or stuff, then that sounds great. That'll be easy. If it's going to be something that I kind of have to throw my whole heart into, then of course I can't. But yeah, there's always a little bit of like illustration work that just kind of crops up and you're like, well, I don't want to turn it down because they might not call me next time.
Yeah. When was the last time you did layout work?
It was a long time ago. It was pre-Kaijumax, so almost 10 years ago.
It's interesting because you were doing a lot of layout work for DC.
Yeah. And Vertigo, yeah.
And Vertigo. And the interesting thing is like that role may exist and be a lot more prominent than I realized, but I didn't really realize that there were people who were still doing kind of layouts only type stuff.
There weren't really. I mean, I almost kind of, I wouldn't say I created it, but like Gene Ha created it basically because he was doing something for whatever. It was either a DC book or a Vertigo book or one of each maybe. And he was like, hey, do you want to do layouts for this for me? Because that's not an interesting part for him. He doesn't, I think that he prefers the illustration aspect of it more than the storytelling part. And we like working together and stuff. So, and this was way back in Vertigo days when like Shelley Bond was there. And so, getting Shelley to sort of say like, oh, this worked really smoothly. And it also like kind of takes a lot of stress off of me because I can have the story sort of like in front of me before the artist even really takes a crack at it. And I just tended to find that like this is the way that DC likes to work with me. Like my art style, as we all know, is pretty idiosyncratic and like doesn't fit for a lot of things. Certainly not Green Lantern or something very serious like like a Gotham City. I would do it in a way that would not be canonical to Batman. And so so this way was like, hey, I do have my sort of storytelling aesthetic works pretty well for DC Comics if you sort of layer a more conventional comic book artist type illustrator on top of it.
That is the interesting thing to me though, is like kind of in 2025, it doesn't feel like roles are splintered as much as they used to be for artists.
Right.
Back in the day, it used to be like there was like kind of defined pencilers, there's defined inkers, there was defined colorists, there would be layout artists sometimes. And now it's like kind of either because of like the need to get additional page rates or something, or just personal preference.
And workflow.
It seems like it's all kind of consolidated down to one person, really.
Yeah. You used to have to slot the letterer in between the penciler and inker. And so, like you are, shipping those pages back to New York for, Todd Klein or whatever to come in and letter it on the boards and then send it to the inker. And so it made less sense to send it back to the penciler. Or you might as well have the penciler keep penciling and the inker keep inking as long as they're. And so I think that's the main thing and then it's like a person being the penciler inker combined makes a lot more sense now than it did then.
Absolutely. Before we talk about Sleep, your upcoming Image comic series, I did have a couple things I want to talk about first. And one was something I realized while I was prepping for this. Zander, there hasn't been an issue of Kaijumax in a while.
Oh my gosh.
Are you
I
late?
forgot.
What's going on? Did you forget? What's happening?
Yeah. I mean, oh, wow. Oh, geez, that's right. I should really get back on that.
Yeah, when's season 7 coming, man?
Oh, man. See, now you're making me a little sad. I mean, I don't want people to be bummed that there's no Kaijumax.
It is kind of funny, though, because when I was reading the intro, I was just like, this is weird not saying Kaijumax.
Right. Right. I know. I miss it for sure. But I also, it's a relief not to have to be like in kaiju mode all the time, and like, oh, there's a brand new kaiju movie. I gotta go see it. I gotta see it immediately because I have to like incorporate it into whatever. And so
I thought it was really funny. I was reading a Comics Journal interview with you, and they brought up Godzilla -1, and I think they like fully expected you to just be like, "Oh my god, masterpiece! This is amazing." You're like, "Eh."
yeah, no, it's great. It's a great,
It's not
great
what you
movie.
want, though.
But yeah, like I want the dumbest one. Like don't talk to me about what's a good monster movie. Like I'm not gonna recommend a good one. Like I'm gonna be like, oh yeah, all monsters attack. It's like a clip show. It's very stupid. It's got Godzilla's son in it. He's a weirdo, and like, and a kid who dreams of his way to Monster Island. It's super dumb. It's the best.
Yeah. I mean, that is like the funny thing about those types of movies. I saw this person post on Blue Sky about how there's all these movies being made that are like trying to like tap into the energy that like 80s movies that were so bad that they're so good.
Yeah, I saw that too.
Yeah, and like they were like, the problem is they know what they're doing, and you can't know what you're doing. You have to think you're making a good movie. And I'm like, I've been saying that for years, and I almost think that to some degree is the case with kaiju movies too. Don't get me wrong, love Godzilla -1. I love Shin Godzilla. Great movies. Shin Godzilla, probably the best movie you'll ever see about like basically infrastructure in Japan and how things work in bureaucracy.
Totally.
But at the same time, there's also part of me, it's just like, I just want a dude in a suit punching someone.
Yeah, I like that too. And I mean, I think that a lot of times it's like we need to make movies for less money. Like we need to just kind of like go, all right, let's find the guys who are like making monster stuff or making monster suits and monster cities or cities to smush, and like let's just film this, and not so much make it that it's bad, but it's like like you make it for less money and make 5 of them, like. Anyway, yeah, but I agree. I think it would be too bad to sort of try to emulate bad movies, whatever genre they are, because it's like, I don't know, like it's when people get too in love with their influences that they try to just do that. And it's like, we've seen that. We've seen the best version of that. I want to see your new stuff. Like if a musician who's like, I've just decided I'm going to do blues covers now. And it's like, we've seen the blues covers. Just do you're a folk singer, do your folk songs, that we love.
Speaking of things that people have done for a long time, is there a hangover with finishing a project that lasts as long as Kaijumax did? Like, did you feel like, I don't want to say a shadow over whatever came next or whatever your thinking was, but did it take a little bit for you to move on from that?
Well, I mean, I was not sad to have the pressure gone, like the deadline pressure gone. Like that was great. In fact, I got used to that all too quickly. But there was also, I don't know. I mean, yeah, like it felt like, oh, every single thing I do, every 6-page story or every issue felt like this incredible amount of effort just to get it going. And I forgot how much like, oh, having a little bit of momentum on a series and having like, characters that what they're going to do and people who like them, like that's kind of nice. You're going at a good clip already.
Mm-hmm.
Where it was kind of hard to like kind of start from zero every time I was doing these smaller projects. I don't know about hangover. Certainly, I got very, very used to not having to turn in a comic every 6 weeks or whatever. That was awesome.
Did you get too used to it though?
Too used to it for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and now it's like I'm back on that grind again a little bit, and it's like, oh, it's hard and it stresses me out. And I mean, and you have to realize, oh yeah, you know what? I don't have to draw every single leaf on every single tree. Like when you start doing something, you get really excited about like, doing a great job, and then you start realizing, I'm not doing illustration. I'm doing a comic book. I need to dial it back a little bit and get these panels done instead of trying to wow everyone with my beautiful drawings.
Well, so the final issue of Kaijumax arrived in April 2022. Sleep number 1 arrives in May 2025. I know you talked about how you were doing some other things. There was a Rick and Morty one shot, a story in Edge of Spider-Verse, a story in Ahoy's Project Cryptid, probably some other things I'm forgetting. I am curious as to what led to that gap. Was it just about figuring out what you wanted to do next after such a monster experience in Kaijumax, or were you just trying to put some small things in there to just kind of change your palette up a little bit? What was that all about?
I was sort of like, it's like, oh, I might possibly do this and I might possibly do that. And there are a couple things that kind of didn't get off the ground. But yeah, a lot of it was just sort of, I was tired.
Yeah.
Like, again, like I was saying, it's hard to get a bunch of things off the ground. Like, you realize, like, oh, you get a lot done when you have to keep producing something on a schedule. And when you don't have to produce something on a schedule and you have to kind of get everything started, it really, your productivity goes way down. And yeah. And so I felt like I was working hard, but but a lot of the working is getting things going, or like making this connection or pitching this thing, and Sleep had a whole life that it was going to start somewhere else, and then it didn't, and then it pitched it to Image, and now it's happening. And so
I do think the interesting thing is that, I don't know, we as a society are very much, what have you done for us lately?
Oh,
the last thing you did, it was 3 years ago. It's kind of like if you go in for a job interview and you have a gap, they're like, what's with that gap? Why were you done for a year? And like, I was doing like personal things. I was doing whatever I wanted for myself, whatever. And like, that's like a mortal sin in some ways.
I feel like we've internalized it too. Like, yeah, it's like when you said that, I was like, Jesus, really? Like that's terrible. What did I do? I don't even know. Like, like a lot of it is just lost because it's like, oh, well, I tried this, it didn't work or whatever. And then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, time has passed and it feels, yeah. And it's like the capitalist in me, or the person who lives in a capitalist society in me, is sort of like, well, how did I let this happen?
Well, but the other thing too, though, and I think this is always important to remember, is like, people are not just like idea factories where like Kaijumax finishes and then the next thing on the assembly line comes to you. It's like, sometimes you have false starts. Sometimes you have things come up where it's just like, I got to pull this one off the conveyor belt. This one doesn't necessarily work as much as you wanted to.
Yeah.
Even for like the best ideas, sometimes they have fits and starts. I mean, like Barry Windsor Smith took like 35 years to do Monsters. That doesn't mean it wasn't a good book.
Right. Right. And sometimes a lot of it is just sort of, I mean, I remember, and now, yeah, it's like, I'm feeling it now, when all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, you've committed, your book is solicited, and the like I Love Lucy sort of conveyor belt starts.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, now I got to keep up. And you're like, I want to put that, not that I want to put it off as long as possible, but you want to be ready,
Right.
And so there's a lot of that. I mean, it's like, yeah, I've got idea. I mean, it only takes so many ideas to be like, well, that's could be a 20 years mapped out, depending on how long each of these things go. But it's like, sometimes you're just sort of like, I'm a little afraid that I don't have this quite locked in enough that I could hit the ground running.
You talked about Kaijumax being something like, you had everything set. It's like, the characters, the world, these things. You can just put them in a different situation and then you have a story.
Mm-hmm.
With something new, you don't have that necessarily. You have to build up that world. You have to build up those characters. You have to do all these things. Is that part of the reason why you ended up working with existing properties for a bit, if only because it kind of gave you a structure to build off of in between the big next things?
Oh yeah. Well, and I think also, like, you can't ever just do one issue of like a brand new comic that you came up with. You know what I mean? Like, that would take a year to pitch and draw and get published. Whereas if somebody says, you want to do Rick and Morty, you can start next week, but great. Like that. I mean, that's the only way you can do it. That's the only way that you could sort of like slot in that job. I like doing that Rick and Morty comic, but it wasn't like something I had to sort of like hinge all my hopes on, or have it be the most important thing in the world to me. It's like, oh no, it's just a fun way to spend whatever 4 weeks or something.
I mean, it's like doing a Toxic Avenger cover.
It is like that.
Yeah. I mean, you did a
Toxic Avenger cover was super fun.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but that's part of the thing too, though, is like, you got to scratch a bunch of different itches. You got to have some fun. I mean, you make money for being paid for doing the work that you're doing.
Yeah.
You got to work with some different people. There's all these different things you kind of get to put in there. And I don't know. I mean, sometimes you need a palate cleanser. Sometimes you need something different. And I imagine that was valuable in finding the whatever the what's next was, which I guess eventually proved to be sleep.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's I think it's really fun to sort of, change up your tools a little bit or refine them or, like I used to do illustrations, like gag illustrations for this magazine called Game Informer, which went out of business this year, last year. And so like it was like one illustration that had a lot of, gags and jokes and stuff like that in it every year. And that was always the thing that I would use to like learn a new skill. And so like my digital illustration would get better and better. My colors would get better and better because it was like a thing where I could try something out, but I didn't have to like implement it for the next 70 pages. I could just sort of say like, oh, I'm going to like superimpose this pattern on on here and see if it gives it sort of like a cool texture. And it's like, yeah, that was really cool. But, I don't have to do it on the next one. I could just, everything could be its own thing. So it was my sort of training ground. And the same thing with these short projects where it's like, oh, let's try a different lettering style, or, oh, let's try a different coloring style, or let's try let's see if I can crosshatch digitally or whatever, something like that. So, yeah, I really like trying little things for a while because you can refine things over the course of a long period. Like in Kaijumax, obviously the art, you know, got refined, but it didn't really change
Hmm.
throughout. But sometimes it's nice to sort of like take bigger swings on smaller projects.
What were some of the new things you figured out?
I tried to do a different lettering style that was shorter and wider, and thought maybe I could fit more words in that way, like Tom Orzechowski style. But
What was that on?
it was that story called, I can't remember. It was going to be called Endgame, and I was like, didn't a movie called Endgame just come out? It was in the Oni Xeno
Oh, right,
anthology that
right,
I
right.
did with
Yeah.
Alex Segura. Yeah, and I mean, it looked great. I mean, it looked great, but it didn't save space, and it didn't. I don't know. I didn't like it enough that I was going to adapt it as my new style. I guess I get too used to my own lettering style.
Well, I mean, I imagine part of the experience of trying these new things, it's not like every time you try something new, you're going to be like, this is how I do things from
This
now
is how
on.
it's done from now on. Yeah.
Exactly. If that was the case, you'd be constantly like mutating and no one would know what a Zander Cannon comic was.
Right.
And so I imagine it's more about kind of retrofitting what you do with things that you're like, okay, this didn't work, but this did work. So I can use that sometimes.
Yeah, and it's like I don't remember, but I might have come out of it with like a better like digital like lettering tool, like brush or tool.
Hmm.
I mean, it was a cool experiment, and it was one of those things where it's like, yeah, I might use it again. That was kind of neat. I have it saved, or like I have the template saved, and so it's easy enough to go back to it. Yeah, I mean, I tried a couple things that then ended up into sleep, like like cross hatching digitally, and and it's like, oh, that's kind of fun to be able to cross hatch kind of with great abandon. On a different layer, and then just kind of use a layer mask to sort of like mask off the stuff that you don't want to show through. And it's like, well, that's kind of neat. It has a gritty feel to it in a way that a lot of digital books don't. Sometimes they have a little bit too much sheen to them. I could sort of play with that a little bit.
Is any part of trying on those other projects after your big magnum opus wrap, was any of that trying to figure out what flavor tasted right in your mouth in terms of genre? Or is that more about skills than genre or anything like that?
It was about skills. It was about keeping busy. It was about, trying to make a little bit of money. It was about, in some cases it was about sort of like, oh, putting my name in certain places. I mean, definitely doing Edge of Spider-Verse is like, oh, I like having another Marvel credit. That's great. You know, and I mean, it's like I would love to sort of like do more work for Marvel or do more work for DC. Top 10 is the only reason that a lot of people in comics know my name. Certainly 10 years ago, that was why they would know my name.
Hmm.
And I think that sometimes that's nice. You're like, here's the thing that defines me, or here's the thing that I would do if you leave me alone. Here's the thing that I can do as like to show that I have like the technical chops. And then here's the thing that is, that gets a lot of attention and is the reason why people have know my name and want to email me and like have ever heard of this person with a weird name.
Well, it's a wild oversimplification of a project like that. But for some people, it's almost like a business card. It's like, oh,
Oh yeah.
that's you.
Yeah. And I think that sometimes when you're doing stuff for those big companies, I think that people can kind of get fussy, like, oh, they colored it weird, or they didn't, I didn't get a good inker, or this, they made me redo it a bunch of times, and it didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. Well, it's like, Yeah, but that's not why you're doing that. You're doing that so that people will go, oh yeah, I know who that person is. They
Yeah.
worked on this such and such, like, especially if it's something where you were the artist on it throughout, then people will be like, oh yeah, Xander, top 10. I think that that's really valuable. And I mean, it's like, I'm really glad to have done things later that it's like, oh, this is all me and this is what I would do. Like Kaijumax really much more represents me as a person than any of the stuff I ever did for work for hire. But boy, it's nice to have people, answer your calls or whatever because they've heard of you.
I think there's two layers to it. There's the people in comics know you and could possibly hire you because they know Kaijumax or they know, top 10 or whatever. But then there's also the fact that like those projects, maybe somebody reads that Rick and Morty issue and they then discover that you have Sleep coming out. Maybe that's like a gateway in for them. I'm not saying it works 100% of the time, but it's a plus.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's like, yeah, I did a Simpsons story, and I had that on my table at one, San Diego, and it's like, yeah, that brings people over to the table. Oh, wow, Simpsons. Usually people who like Simpsons comics only like Simpsons comics, but like same thing with Rick and Morty. It's like, oh, Rick and Morty, you did that. Oh, okay. Oh, what's this? Like it's a little bit of a gateway drug in that particular way.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. From Oni Press comes the true story of the viral hoax so insane it could only be told as a comic book. From the mind of writer, comedian, actor, musician Dave Hill and breakout artist Artyom Topolin comes the shockingly true, terrifyingly hilarious, and only modestly exaggerated tale of how one stand-up comedian forged a secret online identity and accidentally started an international incident almost wiped Gary, Indiana off the map. Believe it or not, this story is true, and at last can be told in all of its unholy glory, only in the pages of Dark Regards #1, the comic so extreme there is human blood in it. Seriously, one of the covers has human blood in the ink. That's gross, but also awesome. So, demand Dark Regards #1 from your local comic retailer by April 21st, and look for it on shelves this May. And now, back to the show. Let's talk about Sleep. It's your upcoming Image Comics 8-issue series that arrives on May 21st that's written by you, drawn by you, colored by you, and I'm going to assume lettered by you because I don't see anything otherwise.
Yeah, it's so much easier to just do it all at this point, which I can't believe I'm saying that out loud. It's such a silly thing to say.
And yet, you got Ryan Brown to do a variant cover because you're lazy.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
That's not why, but still. Here's the solicit. When Jonathan Reason falls asleep, he becomes something else. Every night, it stalks his quiet town, killing seemingly indiscriminately. When he wakes, covered in blood, our story begins. I have read the first 2 issues of the series, and it's awesome. I absolutely love it. It's fantastic. Kaijumax, don't even remember you. Sleep's so hot right now.
Right.
I will say, I am a little concerned about Jonathan's abilities as a cat dad.
Oh.
Mittens, I've got concerns. Probably reasonable concerns, really, at this point. But
probably reasonable concerns, yeah.
Let's start with where it started. What are the origins of Sleep?
I've had this idea kicking around in my head for a while. And so, I mean, I hope it's spelled out well enough in the solicit, but the idea is that we only see his waking hours. It's like Jekyll and Hyde, but only Jekyll. And again, it's like he wakes up in these bizarre situations and, racked with guilt and all this sort of stuff. I always like that as it's like we've seen Jekyll and Hyde, we've seen Incredible Hulk, we've seen all these other things where it's like, yeah, we see the regular guy and then we see the monster that he turns into. But I wanted to do this thing where it's like it leaves a lot up to your imagination. It's very sort of like intentionally sort of hiding a lot of things from you. That was the basic idea. And I was always kind of thinking about doing it as a serial, like when serializing comics online started to become a thing, maybe a web comic, or I was going to do it on social media. It's a lot more straightforward to do it as a regular comic book. And I think you'll appreciate this. It's such a simple idea, and it follows one person, and it kind of like doesn't ever cut away to anybody else, that the part of me that made Kaijumax and put in 50 million references in the background was going berserk. Like I was like, well, I can't, there's not enough. There's not enough stuff. And so I wanted to have there be stuff in the background that you can start to pick out. And so that's why I added that
red
one color separation. Yeah. So, and I mean, part of it was just like, oh, I want his glasses to be red because do you know Jamar Nicholas?
Vaguely.
Yeah.
White glasses?
White glasses.
Yeah.
Right. And so he, and he's a podcaster, he's a cartoonist. And like, anyway, I always thought glasses are really cool.
Yeah.
So I wanted to do, actually, originally it was just gonna be a black and white comic, and I wanted to do this character to have white glasses, but it's black and white. The character is white, and so it's not gonna work very well. And so I was like, well, let's have it be, red. That's arresting, and then I thought, oh, okay, the red is going to start to signify all of these lore elements in the background, and it's going to satisfy my sort of like order need of as a cartoonist to like cram a bunch of junk in the background instead of having it be a bunch of kaiju jokes. It's going to be hints about this sort of like overall overarching lore, because the story is relatively straightforward and just kind of follows a person around as they decompensate.
Can I tell you a funny thing from my personal experience with Sleep and the Red?
Okay, yes.
I noticed more red on my second read.
Oh, okay.
I thought that was really interesting. It's funny. It's funny that you wanted to kind of cram more things in seems rude. I don't mean...
No, that's right. That's
okay,
right.
cram more things in, just jamming stuff in there, Zander, like Kaijumax. I actually think this is a terrible comp. I'm not trying to make it seem like this is that. But in a weird way, Sleep kind of reminds me of Severance in the sense that a lot of it is about what you don't know and what Jonathan, the lead character, doesn't know, which I actually think is really fascinating, and also ties into something that I think is really interesting about the Red is when I was doing that second read, I noticed more, but also I realized that when I was taking notes, I will send myself emails with notes as I'm putting together interviews. My notes weren't questions, but hypotheses.
Oh, yeah.
I was speculating.
Send those hypotheses in. Where I'm going to have a whole section in the letters page that's for the conspiracies. It's conspiracy corner. Yeah.
I got worries about Mr. Edison. I got worries.
Well, you send that stuff in. I'll redact it if it's correct.
Okay. Oh, ooh, I like that.
So no spoilers.
I like that. But I mean, I think that's the interesting thing is, like, in a weird way, it's tapping into the same energy of Kaijumax, because it's like opposites of the same coin. It's like the both sides of the same coin in the sense that, like, Kaijumax, you see everything and you want to know what it all means. And Sleep, you see all these things, but you don't know what it means. So it kind of scratches the same itch in different ways, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, I mean, I always felt like when I was a kid and I was buying comics, and like, you'd buy like 4 comics for the week and you'd read them all 40 times. It's like, yeah, your brain kind of is like filling in all the gaps and sort of, and probably giving them more than they have given you, like sort of putting a lot of emotional resonance on things that are, I don't know, like you're putting a lot into it, which I think is really, it's fun. And I get nervous that Sleep is so straightforward and I wouldn't say basic, but I mean, but there's a lot less sort of like plot, and so I get nervous about it, but I also am happy to be able to do something that is so pure in a way, like it's not kind of trying to cover, it's not kind of trying to be all things to all people, I guess. It's just sort of like, here's a mystery. Let's see if you can pick out the stuff.
I love it. One thing I noticed, the woman behind the coffee shop, she had a tattoo on her arm. I didn't notice that the first time I saw it. And it's the same one that's on the dumpster. And I'm like, what's happening here?
What's happening here?
Oh my God.
Who's giving these tattoos?
Who's giving these tattoos? I did want to emphasize how much I liked one thing you mentioned. You mentioned about how the book is told from Jonathan's perspective only, and it's only when he's awake, and how that was kind of driving you crazy a little bit because it like kind of puts you in this box. I think that is so cool because you get this constant view of the aftermath and the terror he feels from knowing it's him who caused this, but he doesn't know how or what or how he's related to it. In a weird way, this is a terrible comp, but it's actually accurate. In my 20s, sometimes you'd get a little more drunk than you meant to, and you're just like, wait, what did I do last night? And you're like, I don't even know if I want to hear these stories, except for in his case, he may or may not have, murdered his own cat, amongst other things.
Right. Well, yeah, I was thinking the other day, I was like, oh, this is sort of interesting in that it could be sort of an analog or an analogy for alcoholism, but it's not. Like,
No.
it's like, yeah, it's not. I mean, I think that could be a really compelling story.
Yeah.
But it's also like, well, I'm telling a different story, I think, which I hopefully is just as interesting.
Oh, it absolutely is. Well, I mean, I also love the contrast with the fact that Jonathan, the main character, is this pure good boy. During the day.
Boringly so.
So. Like, everyone is just like, they love him, but they also kind of roast him constantly for just being this like plain person who's just like, I'm just a nice guy.
You're right. Right.
I love the line in the first issue. No, the second issue. There's a line in there. This is a very minor spoiler where somebody says, "Goody two shoes, goody no shoes." More like it.
Right.
Very good stuff.
That's right. I had realized that no one had commented on it on his lack of shoes,
Yes.
and so I was like, oh, I got to put something in there,
Are you a horror fan?
I am, but I wasn't when I was a kid at all. Like, it's funny. So my one of my studio mates is John Bivens. He is Mr. Horror.
Yeah.
And so he was always talking about Hellraiser this and, like Cronenberg that. And I was just like, I never watched any of those movies. They were too scary to me. I saw the Twilight Zone, the movie, and I thought that was too scary.
You were too busy watching kaiju movies.
Right. But as an adult, it's like, I wouldn't say that I would watch any old horror movie, but I do, like, someone tells me like, oh, this is a crazy horror movie, like whatever, Barbarian or Hereditary or Midsummer or something like that. It's like, oh yeah, I'll watch that. And those are great. But yeah, like, it's not something that I grew up with. I mean, it's like I would like thrillers, but not necessarily like slashers or whatever.
I always said I wasn't a horror fan. I would always be like, nah, I'm just not much of a horror fan. And then I kind of realized in the past few years that I 100% am, and also probably was for a while. At the same time, like, I have a line. I always say the line is basically I won't watch Hereditary or like Midsummer because for some reason, both of those feel like they're too far for me. I did watch Barbarian. And this is a weird thing to say, but you've seen it, right?
Yeah.
Very funny movie.
It's a really funny movie.
I mean, it's also horrible, but it's also very funny. But
Yeah.
I think the thing that I came to realize about horror that is so fascinating is, well, first off, I like the fact that these days it's one of the few genres that actually people get space to experiment in. Like we were talking about with Godzilla -1, it's like horror movies are cheap. Well, they're affordable, as they would say in the marketing world. And they can make more of them that do odd things and experiment in strange ways. Like, I don't think Barbarian would have been a movie that they would have spent money on if it was like a romantic comedy. It'd be a really weird romantic comedy.
Right. Oh, yeah.
But the other thing about it too is that fear is like a universal constant in so many ways, and it's very relatable in a very specific way. I always, like, one of the movies I couldn't watch when I was a kid was not Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, because I always thought sleep was like a domain you don't mess with. And like the idea that I wasn't safe in my sleep was horrifying. Yeah. So needless to say, this is working for me in that very specific way. I like that.
Yeah. I don't think I've seen any of the Friday the 13th, and I don't think I've seen any of the Freddy Krueger movies.
I've seen a lot of the Friday the 13th. I've seen 0 Nightmare on Elm Street. No, thank you. Don't mess with my dreams, Freddy Krueger. But I mean, it is interesting. Like, do you find that, I guess, like when you were developing the core idea, what made the sleep part of it interesting to you?
I think it was just the unreliable narrator aspect of it. Just the holes in the story. I always loved it when comics sometimes, but movies did that too, where it's like, there was like, you almost like we're trying to like look around the corner into the movie screens. Like, I don't have any information. I'm trying to figure out this information. And I always really liked that about it. And I had kind of tinkered with ideas about sort of like having a guardian angel that was basically like a guardian demon or whatever. And I kind of liked the idea that this was something similar. It's not that, but it's similar to that where it's like there's sort of like unintentional damage and horror that a person causes, and or even just feeling guilt for things that you didn't even really do, like I mean, I always had dreams of like, oh, I'm on death row or whatever. Like, I don't know how I got here. They hailed me. I did all this stuff. I don't know how this is going to happen. And I've got 8 hours to live or something. And I thought to sort of try to communicate that kind of feeling would be kind of fun. Not fun is the wrong word, but yeah, it's fun.
I'm going to say this, and this would definitely go in your hypotheses zone. It's interesting because it kind of ties into what you were saying. Technically, we don't know it's Jonathan.
Right. I mean, well, you know what you know. You know what you've seen, and that's all.
And you know what he thinks.
Yeah.
Again, you got me going. I mean, after this, I'm going to write you an email with a bunch of ideas.
Oh, boy. I can't wait.
It's going to be like 30 items long. We're like, we need to talk about the paint guy. We got to talk about the paint guy now. I will say, on social media, or actually on a write-up I did about sleep when it was announced, I did estimate that it was going to be 20% sad. I think it might be more than 20% sad. But I will say it really works for it, and not just because I like sad stories.
Sadness is not necessarily is part of it, but I wanted to have it be like viscerally upsetting. It's more than that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe sad is not the right term. It's really fascinating because like Jonathan is a character because like fundamentally he doesn't know what's happening and he feels like he's immediately spiraling basically because he feels like he has to be related to it. Maybe it isn't sad. Maybe it's more than 20% upsetting.
Yeah, it's upsetting. There'll be some sad stuff in there too. I mean, you know what's kind of funny too is just from a conceptual point of view, where it's like, well, obviously you do, comics are always kind of done in order. It's written, it's planned, and all this sort of stuff out to the last issue. But a lot of it was just sort of like, well, I kind of plotted out the beginning and end of each issue. Like, okay, this is how he goes to sleep this issue, and this is how he wakes up the next issue, and all that
And you
sort of
kind of
stuff.
fill in the middle.
And then I kind of backfill it all with the stuff, because you kind of are like, well, I need to like talk about this sort of philosophical point, and I need to sort of hint at this, and I need to have this red thing in the background, and I need to, I need to have this person say this thing, and that's kind of a fun way to do it in a way, especially since there's so much. In a way, there's a lot of room to do that stuff because not a lot is happening in these issues, and so it's like I kind of want him to run into people and have them say this or that, and even as we sort of like follow him on his relatively logical and relatively sort of like rational, like I wanted him to be a fairly rational person in this situation, because I mean there's always like werewolf stories where like, all right, well, what does this person do to keep making sure that they don't harm people? And
Right.
I wanted him to be a fairly rational person, or at least have his irrationality be explained by outer forces.
Before we started recording, you said you were through the second issue. Do you know how each issue, because this is an 8-issue series, do you know how they each begin and end?
Oh yeah.
So you had that before you even started the whole series.
Well, in fact, when I sent in the pitch, I only had it planned up to issue 6.
Mm-hmm.
It has sort of a shocking, if I may flatter myself, it has sort of a shocking moment there. But then I was going to have it go on for several, like, maybe even 8 more issues.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was like, oh no, I think I can get all that information and kind of get the whole idea across basically in 2 more issues, which is a significantly smaller than what I thought it was originally going to be. But I think that that's going to be better because I felt like I'd be really stretching it out if
Yeah.
I had. So yeah, we're gonna start seeing another color. But yeah, I have it all pretty planned out, but I don't have, but I don't have a script or anything. I just am sort of like, oh, I have this moment sort of planned out, and I have a lot of lore and sort of backstory and stuff planned out, but I just write stuff on the day, basically. I write the dialogue almost after I lay it out and say like, oh yeah, here's gonna be a bunch of stuff, and now I'm gonna write this page, sort of laying it out and writing the dialogue at the same time.
Is that an interesting creative exercise? Like kind of going in with just these, what's the word I'm looking for? Prompts? Like it almost feels like the
Yeah.
beginning and end or a prompt for like what happens in between there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it very much feels like it's like it's where the rubber hits the road comics wise. You don't want to, like, I can sort of feel like sometimes I overscript. And so like or I write like a writer, and so like people aren't doing stuff that's very interesting. And so I sometimes need to say like, okay, this is a conversation that leads to this moment of violence or something like that. Let's draw this moment of violence. Okay, let's work backwards a couple panels and just sort of see like what's going to have to be the lead up to that. And then I start to realize, oh, okay, I only have maybe 3 or 4 panels to sort of have these people sort of have a direct conversation, which I might have written out to be a little bit longer if it had been a script. And I feel like unless it's something that's very, very talky on purpose, it's more useful to visually block out the scene rather than write it out.
This is all very fascinating to me because I'm not saying that this is necessarily, well, maybe it is why you did it. It's not like you didn't know you were doing it, but this book seems like it's almost a experiment in restrictions for you because you have color, which is you only have black, white, tones, and red, unless you gave in to your desire to add another color later in the series, but you're joking about that.
Who knows?
Who knows? 8 issues, so you have like a very finite amount.
Yeah.
You have like the process of starting with the beginning and end and finding like where it is in the middle. And then there's like another thing, and I might be reading way too much into this. When I was looking at it, you sent me the first 2 issues in PDFs. Everything is like kind of in thirds on the page.
Good call. That's exactly right. I was actually just going to add that. Like that is, yeah, like everything's in thirds. especially having read a million pages of Kaijumax, you're like, oh, you're not doing the usual thing where you do a half a page, a shallow panel, and then three panels at the bottom. That was my go-to page layout. And then I was like, but when I was doing this, I was like, I would rather do, yeah, thirds. Sometimes there's two-thirds of a page, and sometimes there's like a splash page. But I felt like if I had those 3 rows, then I could really divide those up into really narrow panels and do a lot of like quick cuts, so to speak, with dialogue and with time skips and stuff like that. But yeah, yeah, good call. That was really, I didn't know if anyone was noticed that. I wasn't really thinking that anybody would notice or care. It's just for me.
I think it adds to the drama, but it also reads clearer because of it. And I think that's really great. But the other 2 restrictions are you have, again, it's only when Jonathan is awake, but then also the fact that you have literally, that naturally gives it a daily structure. Like the first issue, I think, is Sunday, and then the second one is Monday.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it is interesting that it's all kind of like restriction based. Was that planned, or do you just like, you're like, what have I done to myself? Like,
I frequently am like, what am I done to myself? But like, but it was, I mean, not all of it was planned. I mean, the color was just to draw attention to the things that are red, and also to mute the horror, because I mean, one of the promo pictures in the pitch, like one of those sort of like proof of concept pictures in the pitch was like just a pile of bodies, and like just the gruesomest stuff. And you know how, I mean, I draw things in a silly way, but this is like real people whose heads have really been torn off. And so like, I wanted to mute that a little bit, because it's like, well, I'm not trying to like make you barf. I'm just trying to like give you like a sense of like, oh, this is so grim. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a limitation, but it was also like, it's a little bit freeing because you don't have to worry about what color, like kind of regular life is.
yeah.
In Kaijumax, it's like color was fun because all the monsters are different colors, and you can do fun stuff with like sunsets and stuff. Whereas this is just like, well, this is kind of ordinary people. I'd just be making hypercolor shirts and stuff. So like, because it's set in the 90s. Of course, that's another, that's my restriction that helps me, which is no cell phones, no cameras.
It's funny. I did wonder when it was taking place, because I don't think you ever specifically say that in the first 2 issues, but somebody does pay for a coffee for $1.32 by check.
By check. Yeah.
That did suggest to me that it was not 2025, because that is a cheap cup of coffee paid for by check.
Yeah, and there's a date on the check too. So yeah, he used a payphone, and like, like all this stuff that I kind of have to be like looking up again. I'm like, I could probably draw a passable payphone from memory, but it's like, I got to really look this up. Like,
Leave it to me to pay attention to the fact that it was $1.32 for a coffee and not pay attention to the date. I'm like, who could ever solve this mystery when it's taking place?
Right. I'll use my giant brain and think about coffee prices.
Coffee prices. Let me look up the index of how much coffee has cost over the years, and not Starbucks. And what is it? Qui Vive?
Yeah, Qui Vive.
Yeah. I do like what is the name of the first mate on the Pequod? You had me Googling Starbuck for the first mate of the Pequod, but he, again, did not look at the date, which is now 1996. I can now see that clearly.
Right. Well, it's funny too. I mean, all that coffee shop stuff is all from me I worked at Caribou Coffee, which is basically just another chain. I put that trivia up one day and really made people mad that everybody was saying Starbuck all day long in
That's hilarious.
Their competition.
Do you like restrictions in your work?
Yeah, I do. I mean, 24-hour comics, I've done like 5 or 6 of them.
You seem like you'd be really good at that.
I mean, they're not good comics, but yeah, I was really good at it. I mean, like, well, I think I love lowering people's expectations. It's excellent, like it's, and my own expectations, I think, is really more the key, where it's like, if you can just like start knocking things out and say to yourself, I'll fix these later. And then you come back later and you're like, oh, one thing needs to be fixed, but like the other 6 are fine. Like I was just too into it.
Mm-hmm.
Heck was that way. I mean, I did the first 5 or 6 chapters a page an hour. I think it shows, but it's also like, it doesn't show as much as you'd think it would show. Like like a lot of the compensation happened for it in the planning stage, or in the, it's like, oh, I'm just simplified my art style. And so like I can ink it fast enough and it looks passable. I love restrictions.
Do you ever find that they kind of unlock interesting things for you? Like, is there anything in Sleep that you feel like you're like, this is nice because of that?
Yeah, because since it's all done with light, or like
The lighting is awesome.
it's like then I can focus on that. I think that I didn't have. I mean, sometimes I had time to do it in Kaijumax, but like everything is just about value. It's kind of fun to sort of say like, oh yeah, let's have everything be lit from strange angles, or bounce light, or here's a hot rim light on somebody's face. And I mean, I think that that sort of stuff can really that's a great exercise. Having those panels or having the page be in thirds and have the panels be really narrow has been really fun because it's like, oh yeah, like you have to really think about what you're going to put in a something that's like 1/8 of the page across. Like it's so narrow. You can only put in like one eye and one part of the nose for a dialogue panel.
Yeah.
That's really fun.
I like the beginning of the second issue. You do some really interesting things with lighting. I don't want to say what happens because it is extremely spoilery, but a car light creates some interesting lighting things. And I thought that was really cool. Also, I like what you did with sound effects and that with the going across the very small panels. It was really
Oh
cool.
yeah.
So when you develop stories, do you develop how you're going to tell them at the same time? Is it story first? How does that work?
Usually I'm thinking of the art style first, or thinking of the art style at the same time. Like in a couple cases, for example, I was going to be much more in a conventional style. But then when I was like, this is kind of a mid-grade, story idea anyway, I'm just going to draw it like in the simplest possible way. And I think that changed it quite a bit. But like even so, it was going to be more or less the same. Yeah, I always kind of think of things as an artistic endeavor at the very same time. And it doesn't always stay the same, but it'll develop from that starting point.
Well, and all the restrictions we're talking about, most of the restrictions, I mean, like the color, for example, the color it's not just coloring, it is literally storytelling. It is like drawing attention to specific elements. Like, what did you call them? Lore elements, basically?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of little things, yeah, in the background that you'd never pay attention to and would be not, yeah. They wouldn't be fair game if they weren't called out that way because they're so small or they're so far in the background. Like, there's like in the second issues, there's this like wide shot where there are these three tiny little rocks that
Oh,
are
I
red in
saw
the
it.
background. Yeah.
I saw that.
Well, they're the only red things in the picture, maybe other than his glasses. And so, but it wouldn't have been fair if I wasn't doing that trick. You know what I mean? Like they're too small. It wouldn't be fair to say, you missed this.
Yeah.
It's like, of course you miss it.
All right. I just want to ask a few questions about like the characters in the world. What made a small, quiet town the right choice for this story?
A lot of it is just sort of like logistical. Like I didn't want the police department of.
You don't want it to be too competent.
Yeah, I don't want. Yeah, like I want it to be a little bit corrupt. I didn't want it to be, like too tooled up. Like that they would just come in and just be like blast the crap out of whatever this thing is. And so there's that. I also went to college in a really small town in Iowa, and this is based on it. I mean, I've used Google Street View to like grab like storefronts and stuff. There's something very like being sort of a young person and having this town be, not so expensive. It's not so hard to do stuff. You can kind of know people. It's easier to have a cast of characters that kind of all sort of have to run into each other. That's fun for horror, or it's fun for comedy. It's fun for horror. Like it's kind of neat to have limitations on how far they really can be from things. No one really has a car or needs one.
Did you read Patrick Horvath's Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees?
Oh yeah. It's one of my favorite comics. Like it's so good.
I'm not going to say it's the same, like even remotely similar or anything like that. But I think that the small town thing works to your advantage in the same way it worked for Patrick.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you guys probably did it for similar reasons.
Oh yeah. And it shows the brilliance of the protagonist in Patrick's book, where it's like, this is somebody who's not anonymous. She's beloved by everybody as like a regular person and is somehow sort of skirting everybody's suspicions for years and years and years, which I thought was was great. I liked that, she's got this sort of like infinite competence as a serial killer, but that's not what the story's about. The story isn't about whether she's can kill her next victim. It's more like, can she sort of like navigate this situation where somebody else is copycat?
Right. And can she maintain a relationship with the small town that she allows her to do all this too?
Right.
I mean, in a weird way, God, I'm going to be the only person who compares Jonathan Reason with the bear serial killer from Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees. But I mean, like, the funny thing about Jonathan as a character is like, for example, second issue, there's a situation that comes up where he would like to have something happen, but it won't happen because the character he's talking to absolutely was just like, you're being ridiculous. No,
Right.
this is not going to happen. And it's because in the small town, everyone knows who he is. And it's like the small town thing is almost working against him. I'm curious as to what made him the ideal lead. Like, why did you want him to be this good boy who never does anything wrong except for when his night self becomes a literal night terror?
Just uh just have it be opposite, like so that like his motivations in sort of in the day, sort of saying like, I got to do something so that I don't kill people tonight, are extremely pure. Like it breaks his heart that this is happening. It's not even like, oh, it's no problem, I killed this person that I didn't like. Like sometimes I really like a really good sort of virtuous character, because it's like, they're not just like navigating the regular world. They're in a situation where they can't be good, and they have to be as good as they possibly can. And I think that's fun. I mean, like people talk about, Superman's boring because he's just the goodest of the good guys. And it's like, well, yeah, but put him in a situation, like that's what you need to do with your goodest of the good guys. You don't have to put them in the same situations that you would put Batman in or
Jonathan
or
Reason.
whatever. Yeah. Yeah. Like, so that was all I really wanted to do. It was just contrast those things.
I feel like I would get to sleep deprivation very fast as an answer.
Well, I kind of think that he'll be like I kind of like the idea that he sleeps really well, like that he just
he's,
wakes up completely refreshed.
he's like, this is bad, but at the same time, I got to get my 8 hours.
Right. But the awful thing is that he wakes up and he's not hungry.
No comment.
Yeah.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Launching this month on Zoop are campaigns from Ron Mars with the late great Lee Moder for a deluxe edition of their Image Comics Shinku, as well as another special edition of Haunted Girl by Ethan Sachs and others. And there is still time to support campaigns by Stefan Rue, Edgardo Miranda Rodriguez, and more. And for those who are fans of Zenescope comics, Zoop Games and Zenescope have a live campaign for Grim Fairy Tales Unbound, the deck building game over on Kickstarter. For fans of trading cards, deck building games, and more, there are tons of exclusives for this campaign that you won't want to miss. Zoop would like to thank all the creators who have submitted projects and urge all creators to submit your project to Zoop. Click the Submit Your Project link at zoop.gg, as they are providing services to even more creators than ever before. And now, back to the show. Do you know what the terrible thing looks like, or does it not even matter?
And I mean, I don't want to say if I know or not. I mean, like I have some thoughts because it's like, well, I know what it like. I have a plan for what it is and what, like, and there's going to be all sorts of like clues and stuff like that about what it is. But like, I'm still making some decisions about like how it's going to sort of present itself at the end.
I do think the funny thing is that structurally speaking, we should never see it. But at the same time, I feel like if you don't, you're going to have people really mad at you.
Right. Well, and those are the two thoughts that I have too. Like where it's like there has to be enough, but yeah, like structurally speaking, it's like, well, the whole point is that you don't see it and that you imagine what it is.
Yeah, it's a Pulp Fiction briefcase, but in monster form.
Right. And so yeah, there'll a decision will be made at a certain point. But yeah, I also think like the monsters that I draw. I mean, I've been drawing monsters for a while. They don't exactly look all scary, Like I feel like even if I do the scariest monster that I could possibly think of, people would be like, "He's cute.
Can I get a plushie of this?
Give him a hug." Yeah, like I want a plushie of him or whatever.
I want the plushie nightmare monster from Sleep.
Yeah, that's right.
No, I mean it is interesting because it's like simultaneously. I think in some people's, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody reads this and they're like, I can't wait to see this monster. But it's also kind of like not the point, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think hopefully it's not I think intellectually you think, oh, it's not the point. But I also think that from a story perspective, that's not what you're necessarily interested in seeing. Because I don't know that the clues that are left around of like what's been destroyed are as tantalizing about like, who's this monster and what it's like. I feel like it kind of just suggests this sort of like infinitely powerful and infinitely malevolent thing, which doesn't necessarily suggest a size or a shape or anything.
I'm glad you went with the ultimate shorthand as something as an ultimate evil by poor Mittens. Just poor Mittens.
I know people have read that are kind of giving me grief about it. Well, not
I mean,
But I
animals.
just think it's funny where it's like, I guess I'm not as much of a no one must ever harm the animals
Oh yeah,
in a story type of person. I know that there are people like that. Like like the dog can't die, and it's like, yeah, right. I feel that, but I also am like, it's a good way to establish stakes.
absolutely. I'm not upset. I'm just disappointed. That's
Right,
what it
right.
is.
I know. Well, that's how people are usually with me.
I do like how you built out the cast though, because I'm suspicious of all of them in like a positive way. It makes the whole story work. But okay, I did want to ask about the 8-issue miniseries. I like tight, focused stories, especially for something like this where it has a specific idea at its core. I mean, you did this really well with Kaijumax, not to bring up Kaijumax again, but each season having a different emphasis and a
Yeah.
different angle to it. I mean, you could have went bigger. What made 8 the right answer?
Well, Ryan Brown was suggesting this to me, like, he
8 billion genies,
8 Billion Genies. I think that Lucky Devils is going to be similar.
9
Yeah, is that what it
is
is?
9, yeah.
And I think that, yeah, like I think that there's a lot to be said for doing a long, extended story, but I think also, it's nice to sort of say like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this, and it's going to be a hardcover, and it's going to be, and it's going to be it's all in one thing. I think that we all get so sort of obsessed with like, oh, what's the cheapest or what's the fewest pages that you can sell for sort of like that price point, and it's just like, well, I don't know, like I want it to be exactly what it ought to be, which is a solid novel, a graphic novel, but like feel like a novel rather than feel like a screenplay or just sort of like slim graphic novels feel a little bit underbaked. And I wanted it to feel like, oh no, we really covered all the angles on this.
Yeah, I like it a lot because like 8 feels substantial. It feels like you can kind of get through all the different kind of story types or all the things you want to hit up in the story. But then on top of it, let's say you did it as 16 issues. That would always open up the possibility of like maybe you can't get to the end of that story or something like that.
Mm.
And that is an entirely different problem. But I did want to ask about the image of it all. I was a little surprised when I found out you'd be publishing it there, not because you only belong at one publisher or something like that, but it just surprised me. What made Image the right fit?
Ryan really recommended them, and I'd worked with Image before.
Replacement God.
I did Replacement God there, and so I knew what the deal is. Like it's very straightforward, and it's very the more your book makes, the more you make, and it's I think that's really great. I also had a really sort of like productive meeting with Eric Stevenson at San Diego. And it was we could kind of sort of like see a kindred spirit there, where it's like we're the same age, we've been in comics the same amount of time. Like I think that we've all been aware of each other for a long time, and so I thought that was really kind of nice. And and I'm a one man band comics wise, and that really is advantageous at Image because it's like, well, I'm not paying a letterer or a colorist or like and going into debt to put out this comic if it doesn't sell. It's like, or if it sells only okay, and most Image books do sell only okay, or they at least sell only okay. They'll a lot sell better, but like then I think that you can, that can easily support one person.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and so it's stressful. It's it's stressful to sort of like there's a lot of stuff that like another publisher would have an editor badger you for, and no one's badgering me for things. And so
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, I got to write that on my calendar, like, and I got to turn that in.
I do think that that's the interesting part about it, that some people, I don't want to say, I mean, some people do have problems with it, but it's like when you're doing an Image book, people will compare it to running your own small business because there's all these different things that you have to do that if you were at Oni, you wouldn't have to do. You kind of have like, it's DIY until it's not.
Right, right. I did, Replacement God, and I did, and I think that it had started to dip below. So there's a threshold,
Right.
after which you need to sort of like pay in. And at the time, I was like, well, I'm broke. I can't do that. But I thought, well, I'm doing all this work. I'm going to self-publish, and it turns out self-publishing is way more work. Like all the stuff that I thought, oh, well, I've been doing all that, so I can handle it. It's like, oh yeah, that and 500 other things, to say nothing of like, warehousing and all and shipping and all that sort of stuff, which it's like, I just dropped the ball, entirely. So, I mean,
well, the other thing about it too, though, is we were talking about this before we started recording. Publishing an Image in some ways is a foot in the door with some retailers. And so it's like, oh, it's an Image book, I'll get that. But if it was like I don't know, Boom's probably a bad example. Like, I'll say Oni again. If it was an Oni book, maybe they wouldn't order it. And like, that's an odd thing that might, like, if it's the same book, what's the difference? And there's a difference.
Yeah, there is a difference. The image eye means, it really means something. And I think, like, there's the way that they've worked it out and the way that, what they accept and what they put out. And I mean, it really, it's a mark of quality. And I think and it's like, that's great. I would love, I love that can be working in my favor for sure. Yeah, it is sort of surprising. Because I feel like a lot of times you go to a comic store and it's like, oh, they are not aware of sort of a wider world beyond sort of the top 5 publishers,
That's
sort of.
most of the world.
Yeah, right, right. But I mean, you kind of think like, oh, a comic book store, yeah, they're gonna know, they're gonna know me for sure.
Sure. Yeah.
Beloved cartoonist Zander Cannon. Well, they've heard of top 10, but that's about it. Like that, and that's fine. I mean, it hurts, but but I mean, it's interesting that there's these very different worlds. And I have a local store that's half a role-playing game store and half comics, and seems like it would be one of those stores, but no, it's like they carry everything, crazy amounts of everything, and they know all kinds of deep cuts. And so I was spoiled, a little bit.
To close, I actually just want to talk about some bigger picture stuff. And I do think, throughout this conversation, I think it's kind of shaped how I think that you might respond to this. But you mentioned before, you've been working in the industry for 30 plus years. You've seen a lot of the industry in the direct market, a lot of different positions, high times, low times, everything in between. I mean, you did, what is it? Chainsaw Vigilante was like 92 or 93 or something like that. So it's like
93. Yeah.
Yeah. So like 2 years later, it was like the distributor wars, which I love just because it's the most dramatic.
Oh yeah,
dramatic phrasing for
it's
one
like
of the
it'd be at the top of a '90s Spider-Man comic or something.
Oh yeah, it's such a boring thing that is such a dramatic name.
Yeah.
So I mean, you've experienced a lot throughout your career. Who can even say what this stretch is right now? Like, we won't know for a little while, but how does that affect you as a creator? Like, does it feel like things are just not out of your control, or in your control, or, do you just do your best to ignore it and just do your thing?
I only sort of like see the big picture every once in a while, like, because somebody will make me aware of it because I'm talking to them about a plan for 6 months in the future, and they'll say, "Oh,
Good
yeah,
luck with that.
We can't make any predictions because of X, Y, and Z." Yeah, yeah. But otherwise, a lot of that stuff is just above my pay grade. Like, what would I do differently? Because usually the things that I'm doing are making art for other people to sort of like deal with and put out and try to make money off of, even if it's a creator-owned thing. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, it's my problem, but to a degree, it's Image's problem. Like, they're gonna put it into the stores and they're gonna get it to all the right places and they're gonna stock it and they're gonna, and so I feel like sometimes I can't worry about that stuff, especially since, like, I mean, since 20 years before I started doing comics, they've been like, comics are dying, they're dying, and I remember going to the mid 90s San Diego and they're like, yeah, it's really looking tough.
This is
The
end.
end, and it's like, yeah, now that comic book, that show is sort of comically small in terms of like how large that show is now. Like, if you looked at that and said, "Oh, it's just gonna get smaller and smaller every year," and it's like it's quadrupled, quintupled in size.
Do you think that your career is starting at kind of a weird time? I mean, it's like 92, 93.
Yeah.
That was like a high time that immediately led into a very low time. Do you think that may have kind of helped you realize it's just like, I can't get too worked up about this stuff?
Maybe. I mean, yeah, like I think so. I know that my first comic book was Chainsaw Vigilante #1.
Right.
And that was the first, so they tell me, the first black and white comic with a chrome cover.
Was that your choice?
Oh, of course not.
You do not seem like a chrome cover kind of guy. I'm not gonna lie.
No, and especially then. I mean, now I'd be like, chrome cover, hell yeah, let's do it. But back then I was like kind of Mr. Indie guy and whatever. I mean, I did superhero stuff, but like I think that I remember thinking it was a little tacky, but I also thought, well, it's not my choice. It's not my decision. I tried to have him like chainsawing through like a Reynolds wrap, like, like foil wrap,
Mm-hmm.
that was all going to be like in like little bits and pieces all around. They nixed it. They just said foil back
Yeah.
on. And I think that the next publisher I worked with was Slave Labor Graphics that was always holding on by their fingernails, and I think that was maybe a year before Johnny the Homicidal Maniac came out, which really sort of like
Change
buoyed
things.
them up. Yeah. And I mean, like, I think, well, and they had Milk and Cheese and stuff like that, but it was always a little bit like, this is not sort of like the boom times, other than when I was doing stuff for Wildstorm and with Alan Moore, like it's never felt like the boom times. It always felt like just barely scratching it out. It's a good thing that that's all I want to do, because otherwise I would have quit 5 times over.
Yeah. It's interesting. The last thing I was going to bring up is just kind of like where the world is right now. And I imagine to some degree, you kind of have to have the same mindset, because it's like none of this is in your control. Like, how do you keep focused? You just focus on your pages and you just focus on the book. Is that kind of what you do in that regard too?
Yeah, I mean, you have to keep your head. Yeah, because I'm sure you're feeling the same way, where it's like there's not a lot to be like really optimistic about, like in the short term anyway. And so you don't sort of like go like, you know what, you don't dream as much, where you're sort of like, it'd be really neat. You kind of say like, all right, here's what I'm going to do. The next 40 pages, I'm going to get it done in this time, and we're not really going to worry about it too much more than that.
My thing that I've been telling myself is like, I find myself wishing that I was doing better at like managing everything and trying to like get my work done and do all the stuff like that. But then I realized that I'm just doing my best for right now. And I think that that's enough. And I don't know if that's sad or inspiring or what, but it's what I got.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it makes me glad that like the thing that I can do, the thing that I can buckle down and do is just work at a computer screen or on paper and just get things done. I don't need to like, get funding. I don't need to, like get my troupe of actors to be on, to be happy and perform well. It's just, I just got to draw. I just got to draw my comics. So in a way, I find that to be very, very lucky. I think that to have been able to scrape out a career in comics is unfathomably lucky. So many people have wanted to do that and couldn't for various reasons that are out of their control. And I can only be so, sorry for myself for any of this stuff, because it's like, well, what a great job.
Oh, you do a great job all the time, Zander. Your books are fantastic, and I can't wait till people read Sleep. But that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about Sleep,
so much.
Kaijumax, and everything else. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, I really appreciate you working me in. That's really great.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Zander Cannon. You can find him on Blue Sky and his work in the upcoming Sleep at Image Comics. As per usual, big thanks to Deanna Chapman for editing this week's episode. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription site, Sketched, at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Blue Sky and Instagram or following me on Blue Sky and Instagram. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Simon Birch, Pacific Northwest Gamer, Scion, Megan Marsden, T.S. Luther, Comic Book Couples Counseling Podcast, Scott Carpenter, Gus, M.K. Fryguys, Saunter, Brian, Chris Robinson, David Byrne, Milton Lawson, Benjamin Wilkins, Chris Hacker, John Neesmith, John Auerbach, Dustin Weaver, Brandon Heyman, Aiden Hammond, Faith Aaron Hicks, Ben Rowe, Cameron Brown, Jonathan Breen, Charlie Stickney, Tom Drennan, Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Scott Place, Travis Gibb, Darcy Van Polges, Tom Evans, Breed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian, Near Levy, Jason Hussad, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Dennis Hoffman, Jingo Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Domstead, Ron V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Klaus Vandeven, Submin Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePills, Patrick Brower, Declan Shelby, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Liana Kingus, Nick Bennett, Susanna Puller, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Robert Wilson IV, Andrew Carita, Stephen Hull, Philip Myra, Chris Pacciolo, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vieta Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, David Kelly, Jason Nassy, Adam Bogert, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendrick, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Adam Highfill, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Odd Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.